Good morning, everyone. I'm Stephanie Maselli, Media Officer with the National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine. Thank you for joining us today for a webinar for the recently released report, Regulating Medicines in a Globalized World, the Need for Increased Reliance Among Regulators. A free downloadable copy of the report and related resources are available at nationalacademies.org/regulatory reliance. The slides and recording of this webinar will be available there next week as well. We're also using the hashtag regulatory reliance if you wish to follow along on social media. And for those of you who are not familiar with the U.S. National Academies of Sciences, Engineering, and Medicine, we are private nonprofit institutions that provide independent, objective analysis and advice to the U.S. to solve complex problems and inform public policy decisions related to science, technology, and medicine. For each requested study, panel members are chosen for their expertise and experience, and they serve pro bono to carry out the study statement of task. The reports that result from the study represent the consensus view of the committee and must undergo external peer review before they are released, as did this report. I have with me today several members of the committee to discuss the report. But before I introduce them, I want to go over a few reminders. Firstly, please note this webinar is scheduled to last 1 hour. We'll start off with a presentation summarizing the report by the committee members, and then we'll open it up for any questions that you may have. You can simply click the Q&A button on the bottom of your screen to submit a question. And if you have any technical issues during this webinar, you can contact Zoom technical support at 1-888-799-9666 and select option 2. Now I'd like to introduce the members of the committee that wrote the report who are here with us today. We have our chair, Alistair Wood, Professor of Medicine Emeritus and Professor of Pharmacology Emeritus at Vanderbilt University. Thomas Boyke, Director of the Global Health Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. Catherine Bond, Vice President, International Public Policy and Regulatory Affairs at U.S. Pharmacopeia. Martha Broomfield, Past President and Chief Executive Officer of the Critical Path Institute. David Coburn, past Head of Manufacturing and Quality Compliance at the European Medicines Agency, and Murray Lumpkin, Deputy Director of Integrated Delivery and Lead for Global Regulatory Systems Initiatives at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Dr. Wood to kick off the presentation.
Thank you, and welcome to everybody who's joined us online to hear this presentation. Can I have the first slide, please? The committee was charged with examining the ways mutual recognition and reliance agreements and informal recognition and reliance practices are used, to discuss the benefits, risks, and challenges of such agreements and informal practices, including the risks and benefits to public health, and to analyze how these agreements affect the efficiency and stringency of the regulatory system. Next slide, please. It's important to understand the context in which this study was created. And we all recognize, I think, that there's been a significant globalization of all of our activities recently. People, diseases, and medicines now cross borders with impunity. But in addition, the clinical pharmaceutical business has also become globalized. The pharmaceutical supply chain is global in its nature. Much, if not the vast majority of API comes from the manufacturers in countries outside the US, including India and China principally. And many of these settings are thought to have weaker oversight, and that in itself creates a certain amount of problems for oversight. In addition to these structural changes, though, there's been increasing complexity of the medicines that we actually use. Not that long ago, medicines were small molecules, almost entirely. Now they include genetic alterations, cell therapies, and antibody therapies. The manufacture and oversight of these more complex interventions is going to be different. Patients and consumers worldwide, however, are now have access to information in a way that they didn't in the past. These patients and consumers are demanding similar access to medicines globally and are not prepared to wait long before they reach their own jurisdiction. Next slide, please. The committee's process. We held extensive consultations, including 2 open meetings, 14 stakeholder sessions in which we met with regulators, industry, patients, and international groups. We also carried out a literature review and online searches and received supplemental feedback from specifically targeted groups. After that, as Stephanie just described, the report went into a peer review process which was extensive and detailed with 8 outside reviewers and overseen by the Academies representatives. And the report that you can now access is a product of that process. Next slide, please.
Good morning. Next slide, please. So, the role of the regulatory authorities. The core functions of regulatory authorities include ensuring that products released for use in their jurisdiction are properly evaluated and meet appropriate standards of quality, safety, and efficacy that are maintained throughout all stages of the product lifecycle and supply chain, including manufacturing, packaging, and distribution. For the purposes of this report, regulatory work products are the administrative documents produced by a regulator as a result of a regulatory authority's evaluation. So next slide, please. So the work product might include, for example, an inspection report or a certificate of compliance for GMP or official batch release. Or, next slide, it could be an assessment report regarding evaluation, for example, of clinical and statistical elements of the clinical data used in an application requesting approval to market a new medicine. Next slide. Moving towards regulatory considerations, public health is central to the regulatory authority's mission. And fulfilling this mission in a time of rapid scientific change, increasing complexity of medicines, and globalization of production and product supply chains has presented regulatory authorities with multiple challenges, while also opening doors to opportunities in the form of greater regulatory cooperation and information sharing among the regulators. Next slide, please. Each review procedure requires resources on the part of the sponsor and of the regulatory authorities. And often there is little acknowledgement that a similar product review is occurring, sometimes simultaneously, in several other countries. While of course the final judgment on whether to approve a drug for marketing is an important sovereign decision for each national regulator to make as to what is appropriate and what level of risk tolerance exists in a given society, in some cases, much of the work that forms the scientific basis for the authorization decision is quite similar, if not identical, across several countries. This therefore results in considerable duplicative and redundant work being performed throughout the world, which benefits neither national or global public health. Next slide, please.
Thank you, David. Next slide, please. So, some definitions. The definitions we're using throughout this report are the ones from the World Health Organization. And 2 specific definitions are important to grasp. Recognition and reliance. Recognition is the routine acceptance of work products by a regulator in one jurisdiction when these work products were produced by another regulator. It means that one regulator, say in country A, recognizes that the work product produced by another regulator is sufficient for them to act on. Recognition may be unilateral or bilateral, and may be subject to a mutual recognition agreement. Reliance, on the other hand, is different. This is when one regulatory authority in one jurisdiction agrees to take into account and give significant weight to another regulator's work products. It's important to emphasize that the relying authority or recognizing authority remains responsible and accountable for the decisions taken, even when it relies on the decisions and information of others. Next slide. So this Venn diagram illustrates the point we're making in pictorial form. Reliance is a broader tent that includes recognition and mutual recognition agreements in the small circle in the bottom. Recognizing that recognition is a subset and more stringent form of reliance. On the other hand, mutual recognition agreements are the most stringent form of reliance. So we start off with a large circle of reliance and move down to a smaller and smaller circle for mutual recognition agreements. Next slide, please. Mutual recognition agreements are formal agreements generally agreed between two countries under the auspices of a trade agreement. Mutual MRAs in the pharmaceutical sector have most commonly involved mutual recognition of GMP inspections and batch certification in the past. Industry benefits from fewer redundant inspections and fewer batch certifications being required. The public health and the public benefit through more targeted use of regulatory resources to high-risk manufacturers and producers of medicines rather than repetitive inspections of the same place. Next slide, please. However, let me emphasize again, regulatory decision-making, even in the presence of reliance or recognition, still remains a sovereign decision for the national regulator. Next slide, please. As part of our process, we sought the view of all the stakeholders involved in this process. And we heard from many of them the same views. They saw as impediments and challenges resource constraints, report redactions, which made the reports that they received difficult, if not impossible, to use in their own processes, and lack of shared accessible databases, lack of a common policy or framework for third country inspections, and lack of transparency and usability of reports that were shared with and used by lower resourced regulatory authorities. Next slide, please. The stakeholders, however, also saw significant benefits and potential opportunities, and significant potential benefits and opportunities, including improved efficiency and effectiveness with risk-based reprioritization of resources. In other words, rather than the same site being inspected multiple times by different regulators, it's obviously better to have different sites inspected, expanding the reach of the inspections. Joint inspections build trust, skills, and quality. And as we'll come back to later, they also recognized that there was a potential for increased market access where the market for pharmaceuticals in the country concerned was relatively smaller. Avoiding duplication and broadening inspections was another advantage seen. And finally, improvement in public health. It's important to note here that the goal is, and was recognized by the stakeholders, to improve public health, not to save money. Next slide. We tried to synthesize the challenges and opportunities that we identified to understand the value of reliance, to understand the financial implications, to understand the transparency and usability, and to recognize the public health imperative, for example, access where small markets were otherwise disincentivized. We also recognized, as we went through this process, that less resourced regulators had a unique challenge. Less resourced regulators were going to undergo even greater challenges in the future as they tried to grapple with the higher complexity of new and evolving therapies. We think that in many cases, adequate review by these less resourced regulators in that setting is unrealistic, and it's likely to become a major issue for access and availability of therapies to a large proportion of the world's population. Next slide, please. So we conceived of reliance in two forms. What we've called here horizontal reliance, which occurs between regulatory authorities of similar standards and resources, and could be bidirectional, one regulator relying on another and vice versa. We also recognize, however, that there was also the potential for unidirectional reliance which occurred between regulators of differing standards and resources. Next slide, please. And these different forms of reliance would come to be used differently. So both forms benefit from standardization of reports, standardization of procedures, etc. Unidirectional reliance, however, benefits the less resourced regulators. However, they can only rely appropriately if they have access to complete and unredacted information. Next slide. So the key messages of our report, which we'll go into in a moment in more detail, were that regulation through recognition and reliance is now a 21st century best regulatory practice. And as such, regulators, regardless of their human, technical, or financial resources, should make increased use of this reliance and cooperation with other trusted regulators, as no regulator has the resources it needs to meet all of its public health responsibility. And secondly, the other key message was that impediments to regulators entering into and using such informal and formal arrangements and reliance arrangements to help them obtain the information that they need should be removed. Next slide.
Next slide, please. Good morning. In the next few slides, I'd like to provide a very high-level overview of the conclusions and recommendations emanating from the work of this committee and as discussed in the report. This will be followed by a number of my colleagues who will go into these in more detail. Next slide, please. The overall conclusion from the work of this committee is against the backdrop of what you've heard described regarding the complexities of a global supply chain and the increasing complexity of products such as cellular and gene therapies as science and technology are advancing, lead us to the conclusion that protecting and promoting public health is the greatest challenge that will be facing regulatory authorities today and going forward. The first recommendation the committee has is to develop a strategy that will engage all stakeholders to work towards greater reuse of reliance and cooperation agreements and to remove the impediments. And we've heard some already from Dr. Wood of what types of impediments we're referring to. The stakeholders should include all regulators around the world, those that are well-resourced, moderately well-resourced, and the lower-resourced regulatory authorities. Industry members need to be in this conversation, as well as patient and consumer groups. Next slide, please. This slide lists the 6 recommendations. I've talked a bit about the first. The second is to improve public health through better designed mutual recognition agreements. And you have heard that typically these MRAs are negotiated as part of a trade agreement. The committee has some very specific recommendations for involving the health authorities, the regulatory authorities in a different way in the development of MRAs in the future. The third, responding to evolving science and technology. Again, this speaks to the complexity that is developing with the global supply chain and newer types of products that are very innovative and are going to require new thinking in the regulatory realm. Fourth is better utilization of the European Union, the EU-US MRA. The committee was quite pleased to see the announcement this summer that this MRA is now operationalized. However, we have some recommendations for these 2 organizations to fully leverage all the entire scope of what is allowed through this MRA. Information sharing among international medicines regulators, and by this we mean regulatory authorities across the globe. And you've heard today a description of what some of those work products might be. These could be assessment reports, inspection reports. So it is not just sharing through attending meetings where there is cooperation being discussed, but actual work products that emanate from various regulatory authorities. The last is to evaluate public health impacts of recognition and reliance arrangements for medicines regulation. We had hoped when we undertook this journey as a committee to tap into data or metrics regarding how the existing MRAs have had impact in public health. Unfortunately, there is a dearth of hard data or metrics that were available. However, we did hear through interviews of some qualitative descriptions of how resources within regulatory authorities can be repurposed for high impact areas. So we believe there is much more work that could be done in this space so that we will be able to link the output of these arrangements to a positive impact on public health. Next slide, please. So in conclusion, the committee has concluded that protecting and promoting public health is the single greatest challenge facing regulatory authorities today, and for all of the reasons that have been mentioned by all of us this morning. Next slide, please. It's imperative that regulatory authorities at all resource levels, those who are very well resourced, moderately well resourced, and lower resourced, need to find ways to continue and expand upon their ability to work together to maximize the use of the finite resources. At the end of the day, it's the responsibility of the regulatory authorities to ensure the quality, safety, efficacy, and availability of medicines for their jurisdiction in emergency situations, but also in non-emergent situations. Next slide, please.
Great. My name is Tom Boyke. I'm going to walk you through the strategy and recommendation 1. Let's start with the strategy. Our strategy put forward by the committee has elements that apply among well and moderately well resource regulators that are specific to lower resource regulators, to industry, and to patient and consumer groups. Let's start with the well and moderately well resourced regulators. Here, the committee recommended that these regulators increase information sharing and the transparency of each other's activities across the whole life cycle of medicines, and that they do this for the purpose of facilitating more efficient agency resource allocation and more efficient decision-making and reducing the burden of redundant regulatory activities on regulators, patients, and industry. Specifically, the committee recommended that regulators be allowed to share their work products in essentially unredacted form. This means full reports without parts of that report expunged, except in the instances where there's personal privacy information included. That this be done so regulators are able to have information on assessment and inspection information that is of a higher quality, more usable, to more regulatory authorities for the purpose of advancing global public health. Next slide, please. For lower resource regulatory authorities, the committee recommended that these regulatory authorities should consider the risks and benefits of moving towards unilateral recognition of regulatory decisions of trusted regulatory authorities. The committee made this recommendation in the instance where it would facilitate better public health decision-making for these regulators to implement their regulatory authority functions. Next slide, please. With regard to industry, the committee recommended that industry support the recognition and reliance efforts of regulatory authorities, and that they do this by sharing, again, less redacted, or even better yet, unredacted reports with their trusted regulatory authority partners. They should also share health-related data and information where it would advance regulatory decision-making for the purpose of advancing, again, public health and to reduce their own burden of redundant oversight. With regard to patient and consumer groups, the committee recommended that they should support these recognition and reliance activities of regulatory authorities, and that they should advocate that where these are pursued, that they be pursued for the purpose of public health protection and promotion for regulatory authorities to adopt these arrangements and increase their use. Next slide, please. Moving to recommendation 2. Here, the committee recommended that regulator or policymakers and lawmakers should explore empowering and increasing the resources for regulators to expand the scope and substance of future formal mutual recognition agreements that address issues such as safety, efficacy, and the manufacturing quality of medicines, and that they should assure that these are being primarily designed, developed, and implemented by medicines regulators, so again, that they have as their explicit purpose improving public health. Next slide, please.
Next slide, please. This is Catherine Bond. I'll be reviewing recommendations 3 through 6. As you heard earlier, there are two areas of complexity facing regulators in the world, that of a supply chain that crosses borders, and the other the complexity of products, including cellular and gene therapies. And within this context, the challenge is that there is limited expertise globally to address the evolving science and technology in terms of protecting the public health, and this expertise is distributed across different parts of the world. So the committee recommends that regulators consider increasing the current scope of both formal and less formal reliance agreements, including mutual recognition agreements, and that policymakers encourage regulatory authorities to explore formal and informal opportunities for reliance with other trusted regulatory authorities, such that it would give regulators a greater flexibility in responding to these challenges that impact their responsibility in overseeing quality, safety, and efficacy of medicines throughout the life cycle of the medicine. And potential areas identified for this scope exploration include GLP, GCP, good pharmacovigilance practices, inspection reports, preclinical assessment reports, bioequivalence assessment reports, and a wider scope of the product classes that are currently covered by such arrangements. Next slide, please. As Dr. Brumfield said, during the course of the committee's deliberations and interviews, the U.S. FDA and the European Union put its mutual recognition arrangement into operational form, and during that time, many of these elements, particularly with the focus on GMP inspections, are becoming active. However, there are other provisions within the MRA, including inspections or sharing inspection reports of GMP from so-called third countries. Those would include China and India. And the committee recommends that these should be immediately put into place and implemented, and that regulatory authorities should also begin considering the potential for expanding this MRA to include reliance in areas beyond GMP and in a broader scope of products under the current GMP provisions. Next slide, please. The issue of information sharing was also referred to by Dr. Wood. In this case, regulatory authorities, with the guidance from their governmental leaders, should undertake determining whether the current limitations on sharing regulatory work products with other regulatory authorities are still fit for purpose to help protect and promote public health. And we heard examples from other countries and other regulators where they're taking concrete measures to address information sharing impediments. This would reduce the burden of regulatory redundancy on patients, industry, and regulators, allow regulators globally to best utilize the limited technical and financial resources currently available to them to meet their public health mandates, and to bring needed quality medicines to patients domestically and globally as efficiently as possible. Next slide, please. Finally, as Dr. Brumfield mentioned, we found a dearth of data and evidence that effectively evaluates the performance and impact of these agreements. We also noted that many of the agreements do not have an explicit public health goal as they're codified. So the committee recommends that when an agreement is being developed, the regulatory authorities should co-create a results framework with clear indicators and metrics and processes for monitoring and measuring the results and impacts of formal and informal recognition and reliance arrangements that could then enhance understanding of their public health and other benefits and associated regulatory efficiencies, and enable ultimately the benefit risk and the cost benefit analysis of formal and less formal recognition and reliance arrangements over time. Next slide, please.
Thank you, Kathleen. Next slide, please. So how do we move forward? Next slide. There are things we can do relatively rapidly, I think. And the first one is to expand MRAs to go beyond GMP. GCP reports, GLP reports, pharmacovigilance can be carried forward fairly rapidly. We can also start to look at the pre-approval phase. Drug shortages in the generic area have been widely reported. Bioequivalence reports from generic drug firms where they're submitting the exact same product in two countries could be used by one country without the work having to be repeated each time. Next slide. In addition, as Kathleen said, we think the EU-US MRA could be expanded in scope to cover other products, biologics, vaccines, and later more complex medications, gene therapies, and other cutting-edge modalities as they develop. And we shouldn't be locked into the past when we had medications that were simply small molecules. Next slide. So the key messages of our report are that regulation through recognition and reliance arrangements is now a 21st century best regulatory practice. That regulators should make increased use of reliance and cooperation with other trusted regulators. And finally, impediments to regulators creating and using such recognition and reliance arrangements should be removed and may require action to reach that situation. Next slide. I thank you for your attention today, and we'll be happy to take questions from the participants. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. And again, please submit a question through the chat function. And to get the conversation started, one question is, what are some of the conditions for successful reliance and recognition arrangements?
That's an excellent question. Obviously, all reliance and recognition has to be built on trust. And that trust has to come from understanding the processes and quality of these processes within the two potential relying regulators. Having built that trust, and as that experience increases, it's likely that the regulators will be able to rely more on each other than they have in the past. But trust is the underlying foundation for all of this. Other comments from any of the others?
This is Martha Brumfield. I'll fully agree with what Dr. Wood said regarding trust. Another component that would really expedite success with these MRAs is having more of a standardized approach in terms of processes, procedures, templates for inspection reports, etc. So I'm talking about harmonization regarding technical requirements and standards, not harmonization of a legal structure. But we have heard that these can be impediments and slow down the process for the sharing of these types of reports from one regulatory authority to the other.
Alistair, this is Matt Lumpkin. I also wanted to add on this trust that I think we heard one of the most difficult challenges for regulators is going from building trust to having trust. And knowing what the due diligence is you have to do to get yourself to that having trust stage. So that if somebody asks you, why did you trust so-and-so? You have a way to answer it that is an answer that the larger community will accept, that you have done your due diligence and you should have trust based on that due diligence. Thanks.
Yes, I think that's an excellent point, Mac. And I think the committee, saw part of that responsibility as resting with legislators who will have to embrace this process going forward in both in recognizing the requirement for trust, but also in removing some of the impediments that we saw to sharing information right now.
Thank you all. The next question is, what specific impediments should be removed to support more cooperation among regulatory authorities?
I'm going to pass that to Mac first and then the rest of us. Mac?
Well, I think, as has been pointed out several times already in this session, probably one of the biggest impediments right now is the ability to share full information. I think it's very hard for a regulator to be asked to rely on the work product of another regulator when you're making your own regulatory decision if you don't have the full work product. And I think, as we pointed out as one of our recommendations, that if we can get to a point where regulators can share with each other fully unredacted reports except for personal privacy information, that would go a very long way to facilitating the trust and the reliance that we all are advocating. Thanks.
And just to add to that, Martha's comment from earlier on, standardization is obviously of great importance in this, both in the carrying out of the inspections and in the report of inspections, for example.
Next question is, what are the specific recommendations for facilitating a relationship between a highly resourced medicine regulatory authority and a lower resourced one? This person points to the example of the Caribbean regulatory system that you call out in the report.
Yes, that's an excellent question. And I think we thought about that a lot. And that's why we came up with the unidirectional description. The relationship may exist only in one direction. So I don't think it's reasonable to expect that the highly resourced regulator will spend their time providing specific information or education to others, but their work products are of great value, potentially great value to less resourced regulators. So the relationship that the committee envisaged, I think, was that the less resourced regulator would be able to access the work products produced by the well-resourced regulators and use these work products to make their own sovereign decision as to whether they would act on it. The ability to do that would greatly reduce the amount of the requirements for inspections, for review, and so on by the less resourced regulator. Do other people want to add anything to that?
Alistair,
Okay.
This is Mac. Since the example of the Caribbean regulatory system was brought up, I think it points out the fact that for a less resourced regulator to rely on a better resource regulator and rely on their work products, it means the product being shipped into the country with the less resource agency has to be exactly the same product. And by that I mean that it's manufactured in the same site as was inspected by the high-income country, that it was manufactured on the same line. Because often we find that companies will have what they'll call a rest of the world version of the product that is a different version of the product made in a different plant than the plant that supplies the high-income country. And when this happens, obviously, the high-income regulator has not been in and has not inspected the plant that supplies the low-income country. So being able to know that and to be able to compare truly apples and apples when it comes to these products is really critical to try to help the low-income country regulators use the reliance mechanism. Thank you.
It should also be said, I think, that we recognized that there were a number of high-income countries that were using Reliance now, and
yes.
that this is not just a low-income, high-income issue. Even well-resourced countries and well-resourced regulators see the advantage of work sharing and sharing information to promote public health. And some of these examples are called out in the report.
question asks if the report addresses whether a common IT or information technology infrastructure to share key documents under appropriate safeguards could help remove some of the obstacles to sharing information, and if so, who might host, administer, or fund such a platform?
Well, that's a tough question. Who's going to fund it, at least? Certainly, sharing information depends on standardizing the report formats and standardizing the procedures to undertake, that regulators undertake. I think initially it's unlikely that for some things there's going to be widespread sharing without it being directed to specific regulators. That is, it's going to be bidirectional amongst named regulators. On the other hand, there's certainly an opportunity, and the committee addresses that, to identify plans for inspections, sites that have been inspected, reports on these sites, so that people can appropriately schedule their own inspections based on a risk-based analysis of what they can see before. Others? Tom.
Thank you. Just to add on that, there have been some positive examples of regional platforms, regional economic communities, regional health organizations that have tried to facilitate this kind of information sharing across regulators. And that is certainly something that would be consistent with the recommendations of this committee in terms of facilitating information sharing amongst regulators to advance reliance in the building of trust.
Thank you. The next question is, mutual recognition agreements can be quite slow and difficult to enact. If regulators produce public assessment reports, these may be freely shared without the need for an MRA. Does the committee see value in the sharing of public assessment reports?
Absolutely. We think that reports should be shared. That's central to our recommendations. That there should be sufficient safeguards in to ensure confidentiality of patient information. We should think carefully about what is in these reports so that confidential manufacturing information, for instance, may not be appropriate for them. But certainly we think that sharing information should be central to this process. Others?
This is Martha Brumfield. If it's a public report, then it is accessible to anyone, including any regulator that chooses to access it. The purpose of public reports can be different from an assessment report that a regulator does under the auspices of their legal framework and legal requirements and the actual data that they have access to. So I think the two are not the same thing. And the public assessment reports, I think, can be very helpful to other regulators. But what we think would be more helpful is the ability to exchange unredacted information through a formal legal arrangement such as an MRA. But Mac may want to add to that.
No, I think you're spot on, Martha, that these are really two different documents for two different purposes, and there would often be information in the kind of reports we are advocating be allowed to be shared, as opposed to what are in the traditional public assessment reports that are currently available. Thanks.
Going back to your earlier comments about the importance of trust in these types of arrangements, what requirements do you think are essential in building that trust between regulatory authorities?
Anyone? Kate, would you like to take that?
Thanks. I'll address part of it, and I think Matt will probably also have points to say. I think the foundational aspect of this is that the systems are similar, and regulators
Why don't we try and reconnect to you, and we'll go to Mac, and then we'll come back to you.
I think, sure. I think the first thing that Kate was saying was that the systems and the foundations upon which the decisions are made need to be the same. You need to be convinced that the only issues that are being looked at are the product safety, efficacy, and quality, that it is a science-based decision, that it is a public health-based decision. Other elements that come in include oftentimes the language. We all know that the way things are expressed and sometimes some of the nuances in the language and what is expressed have a lot of meaning and a lot of importance. And over time, having a more common jargon, a regulatory kind of global enterprise jargon, so that we don't have misunderstandings, leads to a great deal of trust. A lot of this is like any relationship that's built over time, it's built over experience, it's built over honestly sharing information, discussing differences of opinion, understanding why sometimes even looking at the same documents, you come to a different regulatory opinion, and why that is okay goes a long way to helping people understand why they make the decision that they do make and build trust in that decision-making process. Thank you.
Kathleen, can we hear you now? You want to try it again?
Yes, I'm back on and agree with what Max said. Thanks.
Okay.
The next question is, which of your recommendations do you see as being able to implement immediately, and which are longer term?
Well, we think that the EU FDA agreement, the EMA FDA agreement, could be extended fairly easily with all the provisos that Matt just discussed. The third country inspections that are actually envisaged in that agreement could be executed on quite easily, or potentially easily. After all, if you are comfortable allowing inspections, your partner to inspect in one country, it's hard to imagine that you're not comfortable with them inspecting in a third country. Some of the other recommendations may take longer. The vertical unilateral recognition or reliance also could occur and is occurring already amongst regulators. That too could be implemented fairly quickly. Others?
This is Marcia Brumfield. In the report, we do talk about what we see as some opportunities for expanding the scope of the current MRA between the EU and FDA, as Alistair alluded to. But we certainly learned in the course of the work of the committee, these things take time to get to the point where you can actually execute them, and a lot of that is because of the importance of each regulatory authority developing the confidence in whomever they will be partnering with and having that trust. And we don't think these things need to be rushed because this is important. Without that fundamental trust there, these arrangements would fail. So I think we would like to see things move faster, but we have a realistic perspective that these are so important that they must be done in the right manner.
Does the committee see a benefit to sharing confidential complete response letters or rejection letters among regulators?
Mac, do you want to take that first, and then we'll...
Yes, I think that would fall under the category of the things that we've been talking about, sharing unredacted information. I think it's critical as we're talking about building trust between regulators. They have to understand not only when you make a positive decision, but equally importantly, and often more importantly, why you make a negative decision. And as we know in many countries, including the United States, often much of the information around a negative not approval or refuse to approve decision really isn't public and is sometimes quite hard to share. So I think in answer to your question, we would say yes, that this kind of information is important to share with other regulators so they understand and continue to build trust in the regulators who are making those decisions.
Right, and of course, all of this is underpinned by international pharmaceutical companies submitting exactly the same application or virtually the same application to multiple regulators.
This is Martha Brumfield. I'd like to just add that this is why in recommendation 1, the strategy, we feel it's so important that industry be at the table for these discussions, as well as patient groups and disease foundations. So much can be learned from what I'm going to call a failure, and I don't mean that in a negative sense against any sponsor, but we can learn so much why a clinical trial did not achieve its endpoint that can help move that field forward so that we get new therapies. And being able to share that kind of information with those regulatory authorities where there are the appropriate partnerships is definitely a positive contribution towards public health.
Yeah, and it's worth remembering the controversy when we started registering clinical trials. When clinicaltrials.gov was started, everybody thought that would be dreadful to share clinical trials. Now nobody would start a clinical trial without reviewing clinicaltrials.gov or some other repository to see what's out there. And it's been extremely helpful, I think, to industry, to patient groups and others to see what's going on. So I think we sometimes assume that our current position is the best, and it's only once we've been exposed to a new position, such as the openness of clinical trial registration, that we discover how it benefits all of us in efficiency and openness.
Regulatory assessment reports vary in format between countries, often due to differing legal requirements. Would a common format assessment report help? And if so, which body should produce that?
Well, we agree that a common format would help. And there are many initiatives underway at the present time which we endorse, ICH and others, that are trying to produce, to harmonize reports and others. Clearly, it's not just the format of the report that needs to be harmonized. It's the actual execution of, for example, the inspection or what's required for the inspection, because it's only in that way that you can be absolutely certain not only what's in the report, but also what occurred during the review or the inspection. So we think harmonization is extraordinarily important, and as harmonization occurs, if it's successful, it will be a lot easier to rely on other people, in other regulators. Others? David, would you like to comment on that?
Well, from the point of view of inspection reports, there is some work ongoing at the PICS, which is a global coalition of inspecting authorities in the GMP arena. Mostly EU member states, but also USA, a number of other countries across the world. They do have a common inspection report format, but the nature of the organization, PICS, is that this work is done and members have a choice whether to take it or leave it. But it's there, so it should be a relatively easy process to get quite a number of countries to use a similar GMP inspection format, for instance.
Having a standard way of identifying, for example, manufacturing sites and the line on the manufacturing site that's being used would also be enormously helpful.
Aside from the recommendations to regulatory authorities, does your strategy or recommendations touch on the implications for the pharmaceutical industry?
Hi, this is Martha Brumfield. I'm sure from the industry's perspective, they would say yes, there are implications for them. We talked with a number of representatives from trade associations and companies on both sides of the Atlantic. And I would say that what I took away from those conversations is there is support for anything that enhances the regulatory review process, that expedites it, that decreases the burden on industry for having multiple inspectors come to the same site for the same product multiple times. In fact, we even heard some descriptive information regarding how much a particular company has had to spend in support of inspections because the same plant was inspected multiple times. So I do believe there is value that the industry sees. The flip side of that is trade secret protection. And I think that is the part of the conversation where we're going to have some deeper conversations. And I don't see this report as a final output. I see this report as a way to open a door to enable some of these conversations so that we can find a way to move forward in a way that best protects everyone's interests.
This is Tom Boykin. The only thing I was going to add on that, Alistair, Dr. Wood, before brought up the great example of clinicaltrials.gov. And it's a powerful one in this context because everybody, of course, as Dr. Brumfield rightly raised, would like to see less redundancy in regulatory activities, but it does come with some obligation on the part of industry to facilitate that by having more transparency, by facilitating the sharing of information among trusted regulatory partners to allow that to happen. And there's a lot of comfort when the reports or inspection reports are positive, and less comfort when the results may not be as positive. And the report encourages a more systemic view on the part of industry to have that transparency, to support that information sharing, because on a systematic level, it facilitates what is in everyone's interest, which is better regulatory decisions, an advancement in public health, and less burden on all the parties involved.
Right, and I think the committee was very clear that global public health is not enhanced by industry submitting multiple identical applications to multiple regulators and going through multiple review processes. And so trying to eliminate a lot of that replication and duplication is in everybody's interest, including the public health.
Alistair, this is Mac. Just to build on what Tom and Martha have said, I think the example of clinicaltrials.gov reminds us that at one time in the past, we all thought that the fact that a company was doing a clinical trial was commercial confidential information that was sacrosanct and not allowed to be shared. The fact of the clinical trial was not allowed to be shared by the regulator. And now we know, life has not come to an end as we know it with having this information made public. And I think, as you said, what the committee is recommending is that we look and see if in these other realms, what we are doing, is it still fit for purpose, given the realities of the globalized product development chains and distribution chains that we see today. Thanks.
Thank you all. And it looks like those are all the questions that we have time for today. And as a friendly reminder, the report is now available at nationalacademies.org/regulatory reliance. This webinar will be available at that link in the next week as well. And once you exit this webinar, you will be directed to our report page. I'd like to thank our speakers once again, and thank you all for participating. Have a wonderful day.